Hi everyone, thanks for coming. The format of this masterclass, we're going to kind of chat and show clips from Matt's work for about 45, 50 minutes, and there's going to be a chance for about 20 minutes of audience Q&A. We're going to get stuck straight in and talk about starting out in documentary and your route in.
Sounds good. Thank you guys for coming. Thanks for having me.
So what were your first steps into the industry? We're going straight in.
I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I studied history in college, or university, as you say here. And my senior year, I thought I wanted to be a teacher. I got rejected from this program called Teacher America. A lot of people ask me, I didn't know you could get rejected, but I was one of the lucky ones, I guess. And then, so three friends and I hatched up this idea to drive around the US for 3 months to try to figure out what our generation was about a video camera, about like a how to film book, and just went on this kaleidoscopic journey around the US, hitting every single state, interviewing people from Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, to drug dealers, to cancer researchers, and I just fell in love with filmmaking. I was going through New Orleans 3 months after Hurricane Katrina as part of this trip, and I'll never forget this one moment where I went into the 9th Ward, which was the most devastated area of New Orleans, with a young man who was going back to see his house for the first time after the hurricane, and just the privilege and the honor to be able to capture this very dramatic moment through my lens. I just remember having the hair on my arms sticking up and just thinking, wow, what a privilege to be able to do this. And I think from that point on, I knew I wanted to do this for the rest of my life.
To opportunity to walk in other people's shoes. We're going to skip all the way forwards before we come backwards to City of Ghosts. In the same way we were talking about the house and destruction with Hurricane Katrina and that house, a similar parallel in terms of a city under siege and devastation. Let's take a quick look at the trailer to remind ourselves, and then we'll have a discussion about it. The movement that the film's based on, Raqqa, is being slaughtered secretly, had existed for a few years before you came into contact with the group. How did that initial connection happen?
Yeah, I think almost all my films have sort of grabbed me, and anytime I've tried to sort of premeditate a plan to make a film, it's never worked. I was traveling around with Cartel showing the film around the world, and I had just subscribed to this newsletter from the New Yorker, the magazine, and I read this article about the group, and just instantly I knew that this was a story that I wanted to tell. I'd been doing some research into ISIS beforehand, and I was kind of going down another path that I didn't sort of feel great about, both from a safety point of view and also from a sort of moral point of view. And so when I read this article, I just instantly knew that this was the story that I wanted to tell about this issue. I reached out to the guys through a nonprofit that we knew in common, the Committee to Protect Journalists. 2 of them who were already in exile were in Washington, D.C. I think I got on a train that night. I met with them, and I started filming about a week later. So it all happened quite quickly.
So in terms of putting the film together, you have all this footage that obviously the group themselves have filmed in Raqqa and that's come through. When you meet them, I'm sure they've already got a bank or an archive of footage. What are the initial conversations in terms of what you want to show, what they're willing to share? How do you even begin to gain their trust in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure we'll talk a lot about this, but for me, trust is everything. And in that first initial meeting that we had in Washington, D.C., I told them, my style of filmmaking. I showed them a trailer for Cartel, I told them how intimate I like to get with my subjects, and so I just wanted them to think about it, and so they sort of went off for a few days and thought about it. They watched Cartel, and they came back and said, let's do this. But that trust is built over many, many, many weeks and months, and so. And like any other film I made, I had no idea where the story was going to go. I knew two things. I knew that they were on a trajectory, which is obviously interesting from a storytelling point of view. I knew that they were escaping from Raqqa, going to Turkey, and then hoping to get to Europe. I knew that they had this amazing treasure of footage from within Raqqa that had already been captured and was continuing to be captured. And so I had this sort of vague idea that I wanted the sort of spine of the film to be this exodus from Syria ultimately to Europe, while constantly cutting back and forth to the amazing footage captured by members of the group from within the capital of ISIS. And so that's how the story began.
And did they have a hand in selecting the footage that was going to form the backbone of the film?
A lot of that footage was already out there in the world. Some of the footage ultimately became exclusive to the film that they gave to me. So yeah, it was, in terms of getting all that and in the highest resolution possible, that was all sort of a collaboration between us. But that a lot of that happened in the post-production process.
We talked, obviously, you just mentioned the level of trust and how that's built, but there's also this inherent sense of intimacy there that is captured in certain scenes and I wonder if you knew or they knew before those scenes even happened. That would happen, for instance, with one of the members of the group when he sees the execution video of his father being shot. Before that scene is filmed, do you know that's going to happen in that room, in that space? Or how for instance, with that one scene, it is such a powerful scene, how do you even begin to kind of put that together? Is that something, that, as I've said, that's set out, or did it just happen off the cuff?
No, that particular Hamoud, the man that you're referencing, was actually quite reticent on taking part in the film. Each subject in the film had its own sort of. I had my own unique relationship with each of them, and some were more willing to speak than others. He was quite reticent, and took a long, long time to gain his trust. But then ultimately, he came around, and I think, as he says in the film, and as happened organically, he does watch the video of his father's execution. He watches that video, as he says, to give him strength, and it was one of the more difficult things I've ever filmed in my career, for obvious reasons. Just the concept of the fact that there's a video existing of your father's own execution, the fact that video and that execution is due to your work and your passion, the sort of meta nature of me filming him watching that, wasn't lost on me, obviously. And the perversion of the use of media by ISIS is also sort of a subtext and a sub-theme within the film. They use all the trappings of Hollywood. Rumors are that they've brought people from Hollywood to work in their studios. They use techniques that I don't even know how to do.
It's the irony of it. They use kind of sophisticated Hollywood action film, Western tropes to lure people into a world that they want to build that's so far from that.
And they do that for two reasons. They do that to sort of dehumanize the violence. They're shot and edited in a way that almost feels like a video game, and they use these videos as a way to both export their ideology around the world and export fear. And they clearly did both of these things quite successfully. Obviously, the nature of ISIS has changed a bit since the film, In
the last few months.
In the last few months, especially. But
should we look at a clip?
Sure.
Yeah, let's go to the first clip, please. So the juxtaposition of you kind of perhaps using a very verite style of this man looking back at an old life. So it's almost a world within another world at the same time. How obviously conscious was that to kind of show a normal life or a life that perhaps we all deem normal, and then how that's changed so dramatically for them? Yeah, can you just talk a little bit about your style and the kind of the idea of verite in that scene?
Yeah, I mean, for me, again, trust is everything, and that was that for that particular scene. That trust had to be developed quite quickly. I'd only been with them for a few days, and so I had to make them comfortable with me, filming, with me being in that room, and to, let their guard down and to be themselves. And I think, that a number of things happened. I mean, I think it's really important in breaking down those barriers to be very transparent with your intentions. I often sit down with my subjects before I film and just tell them that I have no preconceived notions of where I want this story to go. I'm not scripting this. This is not reality TV. And there's nothing wrong with reality TV, but this is just a different process that we're going through, and that I want to just be able to be part of your lives. I want to become part of the fabric of your daily lives. And so I will sit in this room with you as long as you're sitting in this room. I will walk outside when you go smoke a cigarette. I don't smoke cigarettes, but they smoke a lot of them. And so I think, and I also often, when I start filming, I have that initial conversation, but I often don't talk a lot after that. I just roll, and I roll, and I roll, and I roll, so that they know that if they try to get my attention, I'm not going to pay attention to them. I'm not going to respond to them. I'm interacting with them through my camera. And another huge part of a scene like that is it's just me. It's just me alone in that room. There's no sound person, there's no one else. And so really, it doesn't take too long for them just to forget about me being there. And that's what I love. I mean, that's my favorite thing to do in the world is be with my subject alone, wherever it is, in a room, in a shootout, in Cartel land, or whatever it is, and to be able to capture something like that.
In terms of that scene being a companion piece, I don't know, did you know at that stage that when some of them had potentially gone to Germany later on, that you see the rise of right-wing nationalism and you see the protests against refugees? And for me, that kind of seems like these people are like us, and how our lives can change so quickly within the space of a year, 2 years, or weeks. And then you skip forward in the film and you see kind of the struggle they've got to get to Germany, and how now they're faced with a new kind of extremism. I don't know if that scene in particular had been, if you had that in your mind already when you were cutting, or they were completely separate. It was just the way that it unfolded when they went to Germany.
Oh yeah, I had no idea what would happen when they went to Germany. If that's what you're asking. I had no. Yeah.
No, in the sense in the edit, when you've got these things, if it was a intentional kind of piece to show how, with the dancing and online, and how they had, had this kind of very normal life beforehand.
Yeah, I mean, I think my goal, both when I'm shooting and then in the edit room, is to make you feel like you're there, to make you feel like you're a part of this exodus, you're a part of this journey. If you told me when I started filming that a neo-Nazi protest in Berlin would make any sense in this film, I would say you're crazy. But that's where the story went, that's where they went, and it just worked, and it became part of that narrative, sort of out of the furnace and into the fire. And I think for me, again, this story began as a story of this war of propaganda, this war of images, this war of ideas between ISIS on one hand and RBSS on the other. Mm-hmm. But what it became was a story of rising nationalism in Europe. It became a story about brotherhood. It became a story about trauma and the cumulative effects of trauma that we see so vividly in the final scene of the film, when one of our main subjects, Aziz, has a bit of a breakdown on camera. And so, again, that's what I love about making films is just letting life unfold. And I say this all the time whenever I talk, but I really just so believe it. And one of my mentors once said to me that if you end up with the story you started with, then you weren't listening along the way. And I think that's great advice for life, and I think that's great advice for filmmaking, is let it unfold naturally, and don't try to control it.
And once the film has been finished and we've seen it and it's out in kind of theatres, is that for a while to see what now for RBSS, and how is their life unfolding? Do you still stay in touch closely? Are they still very much part of your life?
Yeah, it was quite an interesting experience having made Cartel and with individuals on some spectrum of good to bad or somewhere in between, some of whom I was able to keep in touch with and some of whom I wasn't able to keep in touch with. Obviously the members of RBSS, or not obviously, but I had an enormous amount of respect and admiration for what they did and what they are doing. And so yes, I've stayed in touch with them, and they continue to do their work. And sadly, the story and the tragedy of Syria, the tragedy of Raqqa, continues to this day. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's a clear end in sight.
On that cheery note, maybe.
Yeah, sorry.
Let's perhaps then move to Cartel Land. In some ways, I don't know, at least for me, it's a kind of a companion piece to your film before that, Easy Fire, The Right to Rescue the American Healthcare System, and then obviously with The Trade now coming out, the five-parter, another kind of perhaps unintentional or intentional trilogy that's played out. Should we take a look at the first clip from Cartel Land, or do you want to play the trailer? Let's play the trailer from Cartel Land, just to refresh our memories. So the story of two vigilante groups on either side of the American-Mexican border. Correct me if I'm wrong, but did it originally start off on just the Arizona side, the American side? And then how did it come about that you decided to kind of film in Mexico as well?
Yeah, so I started out, I read this article in Rolling Stone magazine about Naylor, the U.S. vigilante, and reached out to the journalist who wrote it, met with him. He introduced me to Naylor. It took me actually about 6 or so months to gain his trust. Would just call him on the phone, talk to him at least once a week probably. He was quite reticent, just because he thought I was part of the liberal New York media that he didn't believe in. And I told him that I didn't hide who I am, but I told him, I have no agenda. I'm not trying to paint you with, a blanket brushstroke. I'm just trying to tell your story. And eventually he came around. I started filming with him. God, it seems so long ago. The summer of 2013. I think that's right. And then after about 4 or 5 months of filming with him, I had heard about this auto-defensive movement that was happening in Michoacan in Mexico. And I just, right when I heard about that, I knew I wanted to create this sort of juxtaposed story of vigilantism on both sides of the border. I was able to get connected with the doctor, our main character there, the leader of this movement, the spokesman for this movement. I think I spoke to him the night or after I heard, and then 2 weeks later I was in Mexico filming, and then I was basically down in Mexico on and off for about 9 months.
How long did you think that initial period would be when you went to Mexico?
I thought I'd go down there for like one shoot, and that'd be enough to like create enough of a juxtaposition, and I was quite wrong about that, obviously. I just got sucked into that world, and the story became something much more interesting than I ever thought it would be. I originally thought it would be this story of sort of everyday citizens fighting up back against the evil drug cartels, but that changed.
Did you have any idea how terrifying it would be to film there? Would you have done it if, in retrospect, you'd known how perhaps life-threatening or dangerous it was for you?
No, I mean, no.
No.
I had no idea what I was getting myself into, to be honest. You know, I in retrospect, I should have, but I didn't do any sort of risk management courses, risk assessment courses. I mean, I talked to journalists who had worked in the region. You know, I did my due diligence. I found, you know, a very experienced local fixer. You know, I did a number of things, but I had no idea what was going to happen. I'd never been in any situation like that before, and you know, by the end of the film, I'd been in shootouts and torture chambers and meth labs. Again, places I never could have ever imagined being in. But for me, the danger was not at all what attracted me to the story. I mean, those were all just happened to be part of the story, and I felt like to not capture those moments would be to not be telling them the truth of what was happening down there. And I think one of the things that really drove me to keep going down there was I just fell in love with the people of Michoacan. I fell in love with this region and the tragedy of this region that had been devastated by the drug trade. And so I think all those relationships that I forged with people on both sides, you know, my phone is filled with contacts of people on every side of that issue down there, and that's what moved me.
From a really logistical kind of layman's terms point of view, how do you film there? Kind of what camera were you using? How heavy or light was it? How much equipment did you have? Did you have dailies that you were going through, or did you just have to keep on recording and wish for the best? How did that process take place?
I was filming with the C300. Get really nerdy, or just...
Yeah. Do we want to get nerdy? Yeah.
Talk to you. Oh, sure. Like this? Just to you? Okay. Sorry. Okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to turn my back on you. I lost track of the question.
Equipment,
nerdy stuff. We like nerdy stuff. I was filming with the C300 Mark II. Sorry, C300, not a Mark II at that point. A Shep's microphone, and then occasionally had a field producer with me who would use a boom into a Zoom recorder. But much of that was filmed alone. Yeah.
And any of that local crew, the field producer, were they local, or did you bring them in?
So I had a local fixer who was integral to helping me gain access. Daniel Fernandez, he was incredible, and then a local producer as well from Mexico City, Miles Este, who was also integral. There was often just 2 of us or 3 of us at a time down there. Matt Porwall, a DP, very talented DP and friend of mine, who shot some of it with me and was with me there for much of it. So it was a very small team, but much of the Verite stuff was filmed sort of alone, in those situations. Yeah.
And should we take a look at the first clip you've chosen?
Sure.
Yeah. Why did you want to pick that scene in particular?
I don't know, we were just rushing beforehand, so I picked off a list.
In terms of perhaps then being a foot away from gunpoint, being obviously behind your camera, you're in lots of hairy situations. Well, hairy is just such a ridiculous word, like life-threatening situations. You're at gunpoint. And then on the flip side, you're also viewing torture and torture chambers. How does the filmmaker or the journalist, do you have to always remain that person? Is there ever a want or a desire to be like, actually, why don't you all just put your guns away? Or do you just keep on going and use the camera as your kind of defense mechanism in a way?
Yeah, I mean, there's many moments where I felt disgusted by what I was seeing. In particular, the torture, the indiscriminate arrests, the violence in general. But I can't fix the situation. I'm not there to police the situation. My job is to capture what's happening, and so, that the violence was a very interesting thing because, it often would just erupt out of nothing. That scene in particular, we were at a gas station and filling up gas, and then one of the auto defense leaders was trying to buy a car, and so we went to a car dealership. The sort of weird, bizarre normalcy of life that happens in these sort of war zones. And then suddenly they got a call that they knew where two of the members of the Knights Templar were, and we were, 3 seconds later, we were driving 90 miles an hour through the streets and find myself in this situation. And I often wore my flak jacket, my bulletproof vest every day, and for that day, it seemed like nothing was happening because we were at a car dealership. And suddenly I found myself in the middle of that scene without it. But yeah, it's a bizarre thing being behind the lens during that situation because obviously it's terrifying, but I found myself calm, it was somewhat calming to just focus on the craft of filmmaking, to focus on focusing, to focus on exposing and framing. I was stressing out in the middle of the shootout that the sound was a little overmodulated. So weird things happen in your head in those situations.
In terms of that craft of filmmaking, then, is obviously, you've just mentioned the aesthetic of how it's going to look cinematically. That always must be there, I imagine, from somewhere from like those rooms in those safe houses in City of Ghosts to kind of, essential shootout. Is that something, putting the actual situation that's going on, or the interview that you're, not the interview, or the moment that you're watching, is the cinematic aesthetic always there in your head? Isn't how is this going to look?
Yeah, I really wanted the film to feel like a narrative film. I wanted to have all the same devices that a narrative film has, minus the script. Yeah. And I don't. It was all, but it's all very instinctual. I'm not sitting there trying, like, in the middle of a shootout, being like, I hope this is really cinematic. I mean, I'm just trying to capture the scene. But in the middle of that scene, I changed lenses because I felt like I wanted to see something different. And so, yeah, I am, I guess, subconsciously aware of this aesthetic that I was going for with the film, but I'm not sort of on a sort of second-to-second basis, analyzing it per se. But I, as someone who edits as well, I am extremely conscientious, especially in a scene like that, and that's why I changed lenses, that I need coverage. I need to be able to, the scene easily could have played, and it does play, as a 30-minute one take. But unfortunately, I don't think people would want to sit through a 30-minute one take in a 90-minute film of a shootout. So I knew I needed to get the coverage to be able to cut the scene together. And so that is what I'm thinking about. I am thinking about, as I'm shooting, how am I going to edit this? How is this going to, what's the pacing? What do I need to be able to make this a dynamic scene?
How many hours of footage did you end up with Cartel Land before the edit began?
500 or so. Yeah.
And then if you're editing yourself, do you work with a team to go through that? How many people are involved in that process?
So for Cartel Land, I had two very talented editors, Matthew Hamachek and Pax Wasserman, who cut the film with me, and same team on City of Ghosts as well. Sorry, I missed the question though.
No, in terms of, yes, just exactly how many people you had.
So we had three rooms going. We cut both films quite fast to try to get it for the Sundance deadline. So I think we started cutting each film in sort of August of that year and finished in November. So it was a bit of an insane race.
And after its success at Sundance, I believe that's when Catherine Bigelow came on board as executive producer.
Yeah.
In terms of business sense, how valuable was that to have her as an EP? Do you think that had an impact on how widely it was seen and its traction afterwards? And was that essentially one of the reasons for that decision?
Yeah, I think she was deeply moved by the film. I've been a big fan of hers. So she wanted to meet. We got together, and I just asked her, do you want to? Because as we all know, docs are very hard to get people to see them, and so they need all the help they can get. And so I just asked her, would you be willing to come on as an EP to help raise the visibility of the film? And I think it probably helped for sure. Yeah.
Should we take a look at another clip?
Sure.
Let's look at clip number 2 from Cartel Land. We've just kind of seen the enigmatic Jose Morales. How important, well, I suppose it was extremely important to have this kind of enigmatic figure that's very central to the film. Did it all hinge on that your relationship with him and, him being able to carry and be a central part of the film in terms of holding it?
Yeah, I mean, my favorite documentaries are all character-driven documentaries, and those are what I've tried to make and what I hope to continue to make. I'm making my first narrative film right now. It's a character-driven film as well. And yeah, with Cartel Land, I knew that I wanted to have Naylor on one side and the Doctor on the other as my principal characters. He's probably the best subject I'll ever have. He's an incredibly complex person, but electric, I think, on camera, at least for me, and filled with the complexity of the human condition. I've always found, in terms of access, that if you get access from people at the top, that people underneath them often open up their lives to you. And so getting his trust and getting his permission as a spokesman for the outer defenses was absolutely key, because it opened up many, many doors to me. And so right away, I took advantage of every door that was open to me. And that was a very crucial thing, because as the movement started to evaporate and started to break apart, I had forged independent relationships, at that point with people on all different sides. And so I was able to get those different perspectives as the outer defenses became the cartel, became the government, and all of these things were sort of melding together.
I'm conscious of time, so I want to move on to the trade, if that's okay.
Sure.
So the trade is something very different for you, a 5-parter, I'm assuming obviously stemming from all the work that you did with Cartel Land. In terms of its setup, it's very different to what you've done before. Can you talk about kind of how it's for the first time you've had to use field producers and perhaps not be at every location, and sharing your aesthetic with a far bigger group of people?
Yeah, it was so. Cartel Land was a film that I was very proud of, but I felt like I wasn't able to tell, a much larger story. It was a very deeply personal story. And so out of that came a number of discussions, which ultimately led to the trade, and which was, a multi-lensed look at the opioid epidemic. And I knew I wanted to tell it through three lenses, through the lens of cartel members and growers in Mexico, addicts in the U.S., and law enforcement in the U.S., and again through subjects, through characters, and like my previous films, this issue of the opioid epidemic, which still is, you open the paper every day, there's a story about it. And I feel like people are aware of it. I feel that people see the stats and the images and the headlines, but I felt like it was my job to put a human face to it. And so that's what I tried to do. But as you say, unlike my previous films, unlike City of Ghosts and unlike Cartel Land, I wasn't on the ground for it. I had to delegate, which as a control freak was quite difficult. But I worked with a group of extremely talented filmmakers who I'd known and who shared the same aesthetic and the same belief in filmmaking as I did. And so finding those crews, those very small crews, was very, very important.
In terms of it, you've mentioned in what the press say about kind of this idea that it's a war on drugs, but this completely turns it around, and it's the flip side of it in terms of shows, as you've mentioned, the human face of addiction and everything that goes with it. How did you find those subject matters? And there's real moments of comedy as well sometimes in those families and stuff, and it really is the first time, for me at least, to have seen addiction from a point of view that's kind of very relatable to people that are kind of like me or everyone else in this room. Was it very conscious to pick those kind of individuals?
Yeah, I mean, people always never like to talk about sort of the casting in documentaries, but casting is huge. It's finding the right people who will give you the access that you need, who will help you tell the story that you want to tell. And for this, again, there are those three lenses: the addicts, the cartel members, and the law enforcement. And so for me, it's really about the people who will give us the best access to these worlds. And so we spent many, many months finding those subjects, finding those characters, and some led to dead ends, and then others became the characters that you see in the show.
I've been very conscious everyone's been sitting super patiently, so I'm going to throw it out to the audience. We have a couple of roving mics, so if you have a question, please throw your hand up. Oh, loads. Okay, let's go to this lady just here. You want to give it to the gentleman there? Oh, no, just behind, yeah. Yeah.
Me first?
Yes.
Thank you for all your answers. They've been super insightful. But I just wondered if you speak the languages of the places that you are, filming in. And if not, what is that process like? So you mentioned kind of working with fixers, so I think that's the first part of this question. And then the second part is, it sounds like your process is very much observational and verite, but is there any part of it where you intervene or, ask questions and interview them?
So, hopefully I didn't say something really boring just then. It's okay. No offense. Sorry, I missed the question. It was languages. Sorry, I don't speak any languages other than English. I speak a little bit of Spanish, and obviously that seems like a big hurdle, which it was, but it was also sort of an advantage, I think. I spoke enough Spanish to get to the bathroom fine and order food decently well, but I couldn't fully converse. By the end of the film, I could sort of converse, but not really. I'm really just terrible with languages. And so it forced me to shoot based on instincts and based on reactions as opposed to shooting for dialogue. so often when you're shooting, you're sort of moving the camera around. Like, okay, I want to make sure I get that line, or I don't want to miss that line. But just following people's faces and sort of the emotion of the scene, which is often quite obvious, and you don't need to know what's being said to be able to follow that, was quite an interesting experience. Also from sort of just an access point of view, I often would just roll in really dicey situations and just pretend like I didn't hear when people told me to stop filming. So that also helped a lot. And then with City of Ghosts, similarly, I don't speak any Arabic really, and so, but Syrians especially are incredibly emotive with their hands and their faces, and so in that film I really could understand what was being said, even though I didn't understand the words. And oftentimes, at the end of the day, if I had a sort of fixer with me, I would always ask, sort of, did this, and this happen? And they'd be like, yeah, that and that happened, but that other thing didn't happen. I'd be like, oh, well, that's great. And then, of course, in both films, there were huge surprises in the edit room once things got translated.
Okay, we've got a microphone here.
So,
yeah.
I was also going to ask about the language barrier. So, yeah, I'll pass it on.
Okay, great. There's a lady right next to you, just there. And then can we bring a microphone to this lady on the chair here? Thank you.
Could I ask a question that's a bit more practical rather than sort of editorial? You say that you just roll and roll and roll, and you're presumably out there for wherever you're filming for a period of time. Do you just continue to roll? What happens about your budget? Do you know how long you're going to stay there? I mean, how do you affect that filmmaking? That's the first thing. And similarly, as part of that same question, what practical steps do you need to take? Do you need to get visas to go and film in Syria? And what do you do about the practical elements of your filmmaking?
No, I don't just roll and just pray I have a film. I'm always analyzing what's happened. I mean, almost every night when I come home, no matter how long I've been shooting, if I've been shooting for 17 hours, I always review what I've shot. At least try to, just bits and pieces to make sure I was recording or that the sound was on. But also just to get a sense of what I actually captured. And then obviously when I get home and the footage is ingested, I like to review it and often just sort of make selects. And I also write treatments, so like not in the beginning of the film because I don't really have a sense of where it's going to go, but as this film starts to sort of take shape, I'll start writing a treatment for what I think the film might be about halfway through production, and that is often filled with like bold and not bold, and bold is what I think might happen, and then not bold is what I have. And then that document just changes over time as reality unfolds. And so I think with both films, I sort of had treatment, like version 59 on both of them as the story unfolded. And so I'm very, very conscientious of not just shooting and shooting and shooting and shooting. I'm, deliberate in trying to understand the story, because especially in Cartel land, it was incredibly complex of what was happening. All the allegiances were incredibly complex, knowing where to be and who to be with. I mean, just the basic logistics of filming was so difficult. And a big difference between the two films is that with Cartel land, it was literally a feast. Like anywhere you pointed your camera, something interesting was happening. And so it was really important to know where to be and when to be and with whom to be. City of Ghosts was the opposite, where it was quite boring for the most part, because you were with what really was people locked up in safe houses, trapped, fearing for their lives. And so how do you capture that on camera? How do you make that cinematic? How do you make that room come alive and transmit that feeling? And I always say this in the edit room to my editors is let's at least attempt to try to allow the audience to feel those same things that I felt when I was out in the field. And if we even come close to that, then I think we're doing a good job in the edit room.
I wanted to ask about mentors. You mentioned you had a mentor. Did you look for that mentor? Did they find you? And what kind of support did they provide you early on in your career, or even throughout your career?
That was not a literal mentor. That was like a person in the film industry, in the doc world, that I heard speak just like this. I was at a Masterclass and heard them speak and took to heart what they said. I've been fortunate to have a few mentors that have been quite important in my career and my life. John Hoffman, a producer in New York, gave me my first real job at HBO, where I was able to work alongside he and Susan Fromke, who grew up with the Maisel brothers. And so, through her, I really learned a ton about verite filmmaking, and really fell in love with that style of filmmaking, which has sort of defined how I've tried to make films. So.
Yes, I wanted to get back to not exactly the language, but I'm actually questioning this prism that we're seeing films through, because you grew up in New York, you went to a New York university, something like that. So you don't speak Latin. This is very important because I really respect, you said something about Me Alone in the Room, and then there's that guy at CNN, Gloria Vanderbilt's son, who says, we don't just parachute in and out, we actually get the story. But I'm sorry, people do parachute in and out. I love Lise Doucette. She made a wonderful thing about Syria, Lindsay Hilsum, Jonathan Rugman. But the point is, it's not your war. And were you ever tempted in Cartel land just to give them the cameras and make the film, and you said you would edit it? Or like with the Swedish guy with Last Man in Aleppo, or the White Helmets. They made the film, and then an Anglo-American edits it. Were you ever tempted to have them tell the story rather than, because I'm a little bored with people who don't speak languages and don't really, it's not your war, it's not your, you go back to New York or you'll go back to Hollywood or you'll make your film. So it's a career thing for you, but it's their life. So were you ever just tempted to hand them the camera and say, tell me your story and we'll tell it to the world?
I don't think that question is that fair, to be honest, but if you want to answer.
Okay, we're all entitled to our opinions.
Okay.
With refugees that are making films, and they're very different stories than what we're watching from Americans and British.
Right.
Refugees that they lost their parents,
Did you-
their family was killed, they're making it with a different kind of passion than you are.
Can I ask, have you seen City of Ghosts?
No. But I saw Cartel, so
Well,
and that's the one that'll get to Netflix or Amazon or,
but perhaps I think maybe you should, if you had a chance to see it. Okay.
Yeah.
It's very hard for Matt to answer when you haven't seen the
It's okay.
film.
I mean, the short answer is, I am who I am. I'm a 35-year-old white guy from New York. I can't change that. In the same way the people in Cartel land, they can't change where they're from. In the same way the people in City of Ghosts can't change their situation. My job, and I take this very seriously, and I feel a huge responsibility, is to try to tell our stories with honesty, with integrity, and that's something I work all the time. I eat and breathe and sleep these stories, and I do have the luxury of coming home to New York and leaving the danger of where they're from. But I know I didn't feel a need to give them a camera because that wasn't the story that I was telling. However, in City of Ghosts, it was quite the opposite, where they did have the cameras, and that was a story about journalism. And so that was inherently part of the storytelling device, that I was capturing this exodus, and that was juxtaposed with the images that they were capturing themselves. So it depends on the film, it depends on the story, and each story has its own style and way of approaching it.
I think there's 1,000 ways to make films, and that's the beauty of filmmaking. Let's get another question. Does anyone have a microphone at the moment?
This person is.
Up here.
We can knock.
Oh, yeah.
She's waving.
And then this, yeah.
Just a technical question. We saw in that clip when Mariayah was the guy's name, the leader of the Autodefensers, when he was talking to that crowd. Was that just one camera and you basically recorded him talking and then recorded a few dummies? And similarly, in another part of the film, Papa Smurf is talking to a less forthcoming crowd when they're, questioning what the Autodefensers are doing. Was that also one camera? I'm just trying to get some technical tips how to do this two-way, three-way kind of conversational shots in the best possible way.
Yeah. In the clip that I showed, I was fortunate enough to have 2 cameras there, and so I wanted to cover the doctor, and I asked my friend Daniel, who was there with me, to just capture the faces and the coverage for the scene. But I stayed on him, and so for that scene we had 2 cameras rolling. For the other scene you referenced with Papa Smurf, I was alone, filming that alone, and just moving around again to make sure that I had all the angles and all of the coverage to be able to cut that scene as dynamically as possible. I had filmed about 13 different Papa Smurf speeches at that point, and so it was a good lesson in filmmaking because you just never know when something is going to happen. And all 13 of those were quite boring, and I was like, I can't bring myself to film another one of these. But it turned out to be this incredibly dynamic scene in which the townspeople rise up and are challenging him, and it just was one of my favorite scenes in the film, and you just never know. And so, yeah.
So you had loads of dummies as well of Papa Smurf, whilst the guy down there was talking. And
So I don't know what dummies are.
like the reflect shots that are not actually happening when the other guy is talking. So you had a few.
Yeah, I mean, he was speaking for half an hour, and so when I felt like something interesting wasn't being said, I would move my camera and move around the space to capture, all the different cutaways. Yeah, but it wasn't taken from another scene. That was all within that one scene.
We have a gentleman just in the middle here.
This person's. She's waving a lot.
Oh, and right, can we take a microphone right to the top there as well, please? Yeah. Thank you. We'll go to you first. Thanks.
This is actually just an extension of what's been asked. As an editor, I look at your work from a position of envy in the sheer amount of coverage and the quality of it that you seem to manage to get. And you've mentioned cinema verite several times. Are there any moments when you're filming that you will actually ask a contributor to repeat something or repeat an action? Like, look, man, can you hold that phone for me again? Or something like that? Or do you see that as being intrusive from your perspective as a filmmaker?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of if there's a verite line, repeating lines and stuff, I never ask people to repeat lines or recreate a scene. That to me is antithetical, obviously, to the process of verite. If there's a cutaway of a magazine and I couldn't see it, I might move the magazine so I could see it after the fact or something like that. Stuff like that, is a bit gray to me. But in terms of actual content, I don't believe that it's right. A lot of people do, and there's nothing wrong with it. But for me, I don't think it's right to do so. Yeah.
Right at the top there.
So I've been in Q&As with you before, Matt. So I'm going to ask you about. So I know I'm quite familiar with Cartel and City of Ghosts and your conversations with regards to it. It's Dion. So today I wanted to ask you about the new series, Trade, and just ask you about structure, I guess, because it's not a feature-length film, it's a series, and does that mean that you've gone about that quite differently?
No, I mean, I think I brought the same team with me that cut Cartel and City of Ghosts. I think another thing that I love about making films is creating a family, and I want to keep my family together as much as possible. So I like working with the same people as much as I can, and that just makes the creative process so much faster when you start to just finish each other's sentences, and all the sort of formalities of beginning a relationship you don't necessarily need to go through. And so when structuring the show, we all knew the type of show that we wanted. We didn't know exactly what it would be or how it would end up, but we started just cutting it as one long sort of 5-hour film, and then ultimately broke those up into episodes. But that's not good English. We were not dogmatic in terms of like, this is what has to be in episode 1 and this has to be in episode 5. That very much came after cutting sequences and cutting scenes. For me, I always, whether it's the show or whether it's a doc, I always cut my best material first, my best scenes first, because those are what matter to me. And then I try to often just stitch a narrative around the scenes that I think are most important in telling that story.
In terms of the commissioning process behind the trade, commissioned by Showtime, did you have to, were you already making it, or did you have to pitch it to them? And then once pitched, how, obviously it's very different for Cartel and City of Ghosts in terms of, you having to kind of meet certain deadlines and meet schedules and time frames. How was that in terms of pitching it in the first place to them?
It was actually quite, it was not, compared to other, my first film, I couldn't get anyone to even listen to me, and it didn't get into any festivals. I think that's the weird, bizarre thing about funding and commissioning and making films, is that those who need it most, it's hardest to get, and those who are able to make a few films, it gets much more easier. So with the trade, we had a few meetings, and they greenlit it quite quickly, and we started making it. So, yeah.
Can we have one microphone here and one over there, please? Thank you.
Just a quick question. You mentioned your next film will be a fiction film. I was just wondering whether you are moving into that, or you'll be making documentaries again, and what is it about, if it's no secret?
Sure.
Thank you.
I apologize for being moderately or completely incoherent. I've been in the edit room for the past month straight and haven't seen the light, so it's nice to see human beings and sunlight. It's a film called The Private War, about an American-born journalist who wrote for the Sunday Times named Marie Colvin, who was sort of famous for having an eye patch after she was blown up in Sri Lanka, and she was killed in Syria in 2012. And it's about her coverage of war, and then the impact that had on her as an individual. So, and was there another question? Oh, am I
moving into fiction?
I want to keep telling stories that matter to me, whether it's in the narrative form or series or docs. I think the world is changing so fast, and it's such an exciting time to be a filmmaker. I think lines are being blurred more and more. It's funny because I've tried to make my docs feel more like narratives, and I tried to make my narrative feel more like a doc, with actors, obviously. But there's the end of the scene. The end of the film takes place in Homs, where she was killed, and it was a huge honor with that scene, with that. It's sort of the last 25 minutes of the film to work with all Syrian extras, telling their own real stories, and so it was an interesting sort of melding of my two worlds, in what, in my opinion, is the most emotional part of the film at the end. So.
You briefly mentioned the Maisels brothers, but who else are your sort of filmmaking heroes or films that inspire your work?
So many people. I mean, I think, the Maisels, Pennebaker, who has become a dear friend, and Chris Hedges. I mean, they've been incredibly kind to me and taught me a lot. But I learn a lot, like we all can and do, through just watching films. You know, and I often, some of my favorite docs or narrative films I've watched, you know, 5 or 10 times. And I think the best films are films in which you can watch 5 or 10 times because they're filled with complexity. They're filmed with grayness, and you learn something new every time you watch it. And yeah, those are my mentors.
You mentioned the fact that first-time filmmakers or relatively new filmmakers have the greatest difficulty in accessing what they really need. How did you keep body and soul together and keep paying bills when you were going off and doing long filming trips on your early pieces of work?
I had a day job working as a sort of PA for NBC Sports, and but actually I learned a lot in doing that, in terms of learning how to edit. I was sort of an edit PA on this sort of sports show. Yeah, so and then I got a job at HBO while I was also editing my first film. So I just got jobs to allow me to keep working in the industry, and yeah.
We've got a question just there. Yeah. Then we'll come to you.
Hi. How do you use a lot of radio mics on your shoots? If you're shooting on your own, you've got multiple characters. It might be quite frustrating if you're not hearing or picking up key bits of action and dialogue. How do you reconcile that, and what do you use? Obviously, if there's more personnel, it's a bit easier. And also, what's your approach to sound design and music in your films, especially if you like kind of using narrative tropes or maybe fictional kind of tropes in your films? Tell me about that.
Yeah, so again, my setup is often, for City of Ghosts, I use C300 Mark II, a Shep's mic on the camera, which I think is, you know, one of the best mics out there. It really almost feels like a radio mic in terms of what I can pick up in a room and the, you know, directionality of it. Then I often have one radio mic on my main subject in that room, and then sometimes I'll plant another radio mic into a zoom. Like for City of Ghosts, for example, if there's like a bag of peanuts on the table, I put a radio mic in them and then have that feed into a zoom, just so I could like get coverage and have one consistent audio source if I'm moving around. And the second part of the question, design. And yeah, I mean, I'm constantly thinking about, I think, you know, obviously sound is the most important part about a documentary. As a DP, as a shooter, I'm well aware that if I'm not capturing good sound, it doesn't matter. And so I'm extremely conscientious of taking good sound. I'll interrupt, you know, if I absolutely have to. I hate interrupting a scene, but if like a mic is just scratching, if in the break of an action, I'll pull that subject aside and say, hey, can I just quickly fix your radio mic? It fell into your underwear or something. And then, yeah, I'm for Cartel, it's probably an easier thing to talk about. So much of Cartel, the land itself was a character. And so with the land were the sounds of that land, the cicadas, the crickets, which were quite ominous, you know, sleeping on the border. The most terrifying part about it was really the crickets. They were terrifying. And so, you know, I would often just roll for like an hour, just getting those sounds. And in the score, I really wanted to use the sounds of those places as part of the score. So we used those beds of cicadas and used the beds of the meth being cooked. Those became instruments in the score. We would warp them and time warp them and do things with them to make them organically part of the score.
I think we're out of time.
We're out of time.
But I want to thank you so much for giving your time and coming to the session. Thank you for having me.